Ancient Rome and Ancient Athens, Representations of Medea, and I'm joined today by Hilary Yip. Hilary is a second-year student at Durham University and an emerging Latin translator. You'll get to see some of her work today, but it's also been published. So anyone who's interested to read Hilary's work, please let me know because I can send you some links. I am Eirene Allen, and I'm the director of the Institute for Classics Education. We're a US-based 501c3 nonprofit with a mission to make the classics accessible to any teachers and learners who want to learn more. And especially we focus on the Greek texts. So this series, the purpose of it is to retell ancient, look at how, sorry, I got a little distracted, no offense. Maybe I could ask at this point for people to mute themselves just because it does create feedback. Right, so the purpose of this series is to notice how Greek and Roman sources retell ancient myths and invite reflection on these differences. So as such, I'm going to try to avoid over-determining what I think Euripides' Medea means. Rather, I'm going to try to notice, because I'll be on the Greek side, I'm going to try to notice elements in the tragedy that reflect aspects of ancient Greek life and thought. And then, of course, Hilary will give us Seneca's Medea, and then hopefully we'll have an interesting discussion about the different ways that Athenian tragedy and Roman tragedy work with this myth and maybe what some implications and food for thought are. So looking at the life of Euripides, we notice that there's very little we can say with confidence. He was probably born in the 480s. The sort of general agreement is not later than 475 and died in the winter of 407/6 in Macedonia. The first recorded production of his at the Great Dionysia was in 455. He would have to have been again, general agreement that he would have been at least 20, could have been as old as 31 or 32. So we can see where the variety of the range of potential birth dates lies. Last production was in 408, and this included Orestes. And then the final tetralogy of his, which included Iphigenia et Aulis, was entered after his death by his son, if I'm not mistaken. And just note tetralogy, I'm sure you all know, most of you, that Athenian tragedies were not performed as individual plays, but as a series of 4 tragedies and a satyr tragicomedy at the end. And so when we're talking about what does Medea mean, we're already extracting it from the context of the performance of 4, not 1, and even other things as well that we'll talk about. But we have 22 recorded entries at the Great Dionysia, which, if we know our math, is 88 dramas, but there are 92 recorded plays in his name, so likely he was doing other ones as well. And there are indications that he composed plays from the Macedonian king at the end of his life. Likely came from a family of means, given his education in poetry and music, given he was Athenian citizen, or lived in, likely underwent the standard military training and service, possibly served on juries or councils. Evidence that he composed, or suggestions anyway, that he composed a praised ode for Alcibiades following his victory at the 416 Olympic Games, and also a grave epitaph for Athenians who died at Sicily. So just rounding out this picture of his role in Athenian life and who was he besides this name that's attached to texts that have survived. Can't talk about Euripides without talking about the discovery of the new fragments. Recent, very exciting. And I pulled out a couple of things about them that are interesting for us, and we'll see as we go further why I'm picking up specifically what is said about Ino. So I'm not going to try to pronounce a name that I'm not sure. I just dislike butchering people's names. But the scholar who worked on it, who's with the University of California at Irvine, noticed that from the new fragments, what we're getting an idea of is that the story of Ino maybe it's giving us a fuller picture. And she said another woman is the evil stepmother and Ino is the victim. The third wife of the king is trying to eliminate Ino's children, and Ino turns the tables on her, causing her to kill her own children and then die by suicide. It's a more traditional tragedy, death, mayhem, suicide than perhaps was thought. So this is really interesting. Again, just because we're constantly dealing with partial information, these fragments are a really thrilling way for us to really be confronted with, oh, well, what we thought really maybe is the opposite of what we thought. So that's always a really exciting moment, I think, intellectually. And then Naomi Weiss, who's at Harvard, told the Harvard Gazette, I know is a really gruesome tragedy. The only person left at the end is the king, and he's lost all his wives and all his children. And we might think here about Creon in this play. This seems like a tragedy on steroids. It's the sort of experimentation with how far you can push a tragic plot that may remind us of later plays of Euripides. I know may well be a significantly earlier play. There seems to be a reference to it in the comedy by Aristophanes that was produced in 425 BC. If that is a reference to Ino, we know the tragedy was performed before this date. We tend to think, and this is the part that's interesting, it's all interesting. We tend to think of Euripides' super experimental plays as being from the last decade of his career, where he's just going all out and questioning the very form of tragedy. If we are right in dating this earlier, then that changes our understanding of how tragedy developed through the 5th century. So once again, thinking about, wow, this is a really great opportunity to reflect on maybe what we don't notice because of not having access to it. We don't know what we don't know. But also, if we are missing a lot of context, then how are we maybe missing things, little pieces, elements in the tragedies themselves that might be giving us hints, but we're kind of overlooking them to go to the parts that are really exciting for us, right? And they're relevant to our time. So that's something that we'll think about as well. I call these are interpretive challenges. So again, the value of noticing is simply to resist that impulse to interpret and try to collect as much data as possible. We can see in Euripides when we read out of the text that there's an awareness of and a comfort with the intellectual movements of his time. We could say that given the way that characters engage with intellectual and ethical questions, comment on language and argument and persuasion, where we see this sort of element in Medea. It's possible it was produced in 431 and that it was the first performed at the Great Dionysian. I like to think about that because the order maybe feels important because the tragedies themselves likely would have had some kind of arc. And the other 3 that are associated with it, that were performed with it, are lost. 431, a very interesting date on the cusp of, if this is indeed when it was performed, on the cusp of a basically civil war in the Greek-speaking world, also feels important. And I just want to take again a moment to pause and think about all the things that are outside of our view. The other plays in the tetralogy that are lost, the interaction with the audience on this spring morning in Athens when the play was performed, the political, social, and emotional climate in Athens at the time the play was performed, and then the other tragedies and comedies that were performed at the festival. All of these really outside of our view. We don't know how all of these things are interacting. And so again, another kind of warning or alert to be very careful about the conclusions we draw about the meaning of this one piece of a much larger dialogue. A couple of things that Donald Mastronarde notes, and this is in his Cambridge Greek and Latin Classics commentary on Medea, as often seems to be the case in Euripides' plays, the performance appears to be designed to evoke shifting and mixed reactions to the major figures and to leave little room for either moral certainty or moral smugness by the end of the play. Again, we'll talk about this more, just kind of putting things out for us to pick up on in the tragedy itself when we look at some bits of it. Medea had a significant role in a number of famous stories, but in archaic times and in the 5th century, each episode was usually treated as relatively self-standing, and there was no compiled life of Medea in which all incidents had to be brought into logical harmony. I really appreciate this wording. I think very incisively reminds us again of the simultaneity of tradition and variation. So these are oral stories, are being told in a performance context, and there's a flexibility that the teller and the receiver both have to how they're going to interpret these things, and that the tensions are meant to be they're intended, the ambiguity is intended, the openness is intended to create a dialogue. And right. So another thing we have from Mastronarde, he notes the long afterlife of Medea, not only in Rome, but of course in the millennia after it was first produced. And we are naturally inclined to import later interpretations and reimaginings back into Euripides. And while we can't necessarily stop ourselves doing that, we can certainly be self-aware and self-aware that we're doing it, when we're doing it, how we're doing it when we're reading Euripides. And again, just something really brilliant from his commentary that I wanted us to consider before we look more closely at the tragedy itself. Attic tragedy deliberately chooses to portray persons and events at a distinct remove from contemporary reality. The mythic past is, in some sense, a foreign country to which contemporary categories are applicable only through a filter of difference. Kings and princely heroes like Jason and Creon represent to the audience, quote unquote, the other almost as much as Medea does. Moreover, the mythic past, as established by Homeric and Hesiodic poetry, is a world of permeable boundaries. The Greek gods beget children in other lands as well as in Greece, and heroic founders migrate from place to place. Cadmus and Pelops, for instance, come from the east, but their descendants are regarded as Greek. Homer's Trojans are credited with many of the same values, customs, and behaviors as his, and I would probably say Achaeans here, although it is clear that the Greeks, or the Achaeans, and the Athenians sense a distinction from and even superiority to other peoples became much more pronounced after the Persian Wars. Tragedy could look both ways, toward the epic model and toward contemporary assumptions. And this ambivalence is one source of tension in Euripides' play. And yeah, okay. So another sort of question that Mastronarde and others ask is what might, following from that, is what might 5th century Athenians receiving the play in real time have understood of or known about Jason and Medea? Obviously, Apollonius of Rhodes' Argonautica was still far into the future, and that text, Argonautica, came out of a literate culture when works of verbal art were associated with texts and performances, and the texts really were understood to be able to circulate and travel because they had, right? They had traveled from 5th century Athens. But in 5th century, it's hard to know what would the general public have known about the Medea myth. And we can look both within the play and at laterally across the time, the sources of the time, to pull out some of those. And of course, the Argonautic expedition, the use of supplication, persuasion, and appeal to persuade Medea to help him, Jason, to betray her father, and his promise to take her away and marry her. These are all referenced in Euripides' Medea. Her helping Jason succeed in the tasks Aeetes set for him, including and then also to steal the fleece, her murder of her brother, and then of King Peleus at Iolcus. Things that have that we're aware of other versions existing in the 5th century are the idea that Medea and Jason were exiled from Iolcus and outsiders in Corinth. There are some variations offered in other sources of this period, though again, you never know what people knew and what they had at the forefront of their minds. I think the most significant one that we're going to look at some more is that Medea kills her sons, and that this became the canonical version after the 5th century. But in other versions, it's the Corinthians who kill them, or, and this is notable, they die during a failed attempt to immortalize them. So that's really interesting as well. We don't have the ton of time, so in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on one theme that's developed in Medea, which is the revenge theme. In an oral culture, a theme provides the building blocks that both set audience expectations and subvert them by the specific way that the theme develops it. So again, we are in a culture that has literacy, but there are still many elements of orality that are in play in 5th century Athens. So the revenge theme in Medea begins with a grievance. We have the overcoming of obstacles, deception, manipulation, a reversal of expectations. There's a murder, and there's a celebration of success. And I don't want to take too much time going through every single one of these things, because we're going to talk about it in a second more as we look at the plot itself. But what I want to highlight is the celebration of success. Usually, right, if we're looking for themes in patterns in Greek texts, usually when you start gloating over your victory or gloating in any way, that's usually a harbinger of disaster. So we're going to think about that. And of course, the end of the play also, we have the implied institution of a cult at Corinth to her sons. And there's evidence of a cult to Medea and her sons at Corinth as well, historically. Basically, we could say that there's a series of confrontations, and that's what structures this theme. So in the prologue, we have the announcement of the theme through Medea's grief and rage. And the line that really stood out to me was, she lies without food, flattened by her pain, melting into tears at every instant, since she discovered how her husband wrongs her. And this is Laura Kitzinger's translation. And this, if we're thinking again laterally, might remind us of Achilles in the Iliad, grief and rage, and then all the terrible things that ensue. Could also remind us of the goddess Demeter in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, grief, rage, destruction, and this, in her case, of course, of humanity through starvation. And then the contrast, there's also a contrast with Thetis in the Iliad, who has the grief, but not the rage. She never lets things go beyond. When she's summoned by Zeus, unlike Demeter, she says, yes, okay, I'll go. Episode 1, Medea and Creon face off, and he fears her power, but she feigns being weak and powerless. Another line in this section that really stands out, and we'll talk about how these potentially connect. She says, oh, may a flash of lightning pierce my head. What profit any longer for me in life? May I find my rest in death and leave behind my hateful life. Flash of lightning must remind us of the association between Zeus's thunder and the immortalization of heroes. That comes up a lot in stories of heroes. The most memorable being Hercules, that at the moment that the pyre is lit, it goes up in flames, Zeus's lightning connects, and that's the medium that brings him up. And Eleusis, the blessed place where one of the names for the blessed place where heroes live, is shares a root with Enelusion, I believe. So connecting the immortalization and the thunderbolt. And then we have the chorus saying, men's thoughts have become deceitful, and their oaths by the gods do not hold fast. The power of oaths has gone. So there's a indictment of broken oaths, and we know that Jason has broken his oath to Medea. Just again, by abandoning the marriage that produced male children. And then in the second episode, Medea and Jason face off. He accuses her of bringing her problems on herself. She accuses him of being unjust after she selflessly helped him. He objects that the cause of her helping him was not her selflessness, but Aphrodite, inflicting her with love. Then he claims to be helping their family by marrying a person of influence, and Medea accuses him of wanting to marry a younger woman and of caring more about status than family. And something we can notice is that they're not really addressing each other's arguments. They're sort of disagreeing fundamentally, and that obviously this is, if you're unwilling to find any common ground, then you can't really go forward. So that's part of what we see. There's not any other option but violence ultimately. The chorus sings that love without control causes harm. Moderation is best. Big theme. Medea then and Aegeus come face to face. He's passing through Corinth, and Medea asks him for refuge and offers to help him produce a child. He agrees to protect her from her enemies. The idea of children then gives her the idea to have her sons deliver the poisoned garment to Jason's new wife, and then this will kill her, and then she will kill her children. The chorus sings in praise then of blessed Athens, but how can the city accept a murderess? And Again, an evocation here of this, the sacrifice of innocence. The Achaean expedition, we have not any reference to the sacrifice of Iphigenia in Homer, but we do have the snake consuming the sparrows, and Calchas interprets this as a sign of the Achaeans' success. But the sparrows are the innocent victims. So we know that there's something uncomfortable here. There's some tension here between the people who claim that they're in the right and their innocent victims. Episode 4, Medea and Jason. Medea feigns an apology. She pretends to be understanding. She sends him then with the gift, the poisoned garment for the princess. The chorus in their song sing that the princess is going to fall into a trap and will not escape destruction. And this trap is, she is innocent. She has not actually done anything necessarily herself. So we could be reminded of the women in epic like Andromache or others who, Chryseis, all the women in the Iliad who are passed around, and they become the victims of the wars. Sometimes even their own men are provoking. Now, Hector doesn't provoke the war, but certainly the provocation of the broken oath of Xenia does play into the Trojan War. And so, again, women becoming the victims unjustly, we could say, on a certain level. And the chorus sings basically their pity for the princess and for Medea. So both of them receive the compassion of the chorus. And then the last battle, per se, is Medea's battle with herself. After the tutor announces that the children won't be banished, she deliberates what to do. She can't decide what's stronger, her love for her children or her desire to punish Jason. And finally, she decides the punishment of Jason is overrules everything. Something that's really interesting I noticed in this ending is that the line of Jason is brought to an end. That's the implication here. He's not going to, the princess has been killed. He is not going to go on and marry somebody else. So his line is brought to an end. And for me, this feels very much like a piece of the larger narrative of the gods brought the age of heroes to an end. And this is being shown to us through the story of Jason. A couple of places that I wanted to highlight from the text in terms of really picking up on this theme of the immortalization of heroes and how is this interacting, the end of the age of heroes. So the mortal heroes have to die. And then who is Medea in these? Is she just a mortal woman who's been wronged? Is she a princess? Is she a goddess? All of these things are coming into play. And then, of course, we have concurrently in Corinth, she and her sons worshipped in cult. And this feels really important also for this time, given that Corinth was not an ally of Athens. So again, we might be thinking that Medea's being associated with the East. Oh, she's a foreign princess, but foreign in what way, maybe, is another question that we could ask. What does it mean to be a foreigner to Athens, especially at this time? And a lot of also the references to the Age of Heroes is something that we want to notice as well, just to not, again, to come up with any easy interpretations, but to almost really the opposite, problematize any kind of easy interpretation. So at the end, O earth, O ray of the sun that lightens all, turn your gaze, oh, turn it to this ruinous woman before she lays her bloody, murderous hands upon her children. They are sprung from your race of gold. And this really does remind us of Hesiod and the Age of Heroes. And it is a fearful thing for the blood of a god to be split upon the ground, probably meant to be split. No, spilled, yeah, upon the ground by the hands of mortal men. O light, begotten of Zeus. Very difficult to figure out what that means. Like, who's the mortal that's, wait, what? I think hard for us to unwrap that. O light, begotten of Zeus, check the cruel and murderous fury. Take her from this house plagued by spirits of vengeance. Kind of associating Medea with a fury. The toil of begetting your children has come to naught. It was to no purpose that you bore your dear offspring, you who left behind the inhospitable strait where the dark blue Simplegares clash, O unhappy woman. Why does wrath fall so heavy upon your mind, and one rash murder succeed in another? Grievous for mortals is the stain of kindred blood, for the murderers are dogged by woes harmonious with their deeds, sent by the gods upon their houses. So a lot of things happening simultaneously in here. And we have the address to Earth, we have the address to Medea, we have these allusions to the Age of Heroes. And again, this isn't textual. These aren't textual allusions per se, but allusions to this larger tradition. And where do these figures fall? And again, allowing us to have a double vision of them so that we can simultaneously be thinking about our own place, but then in time, but also in all of time. One woman, only one of all that have been, have I heard of, who put her hands to her own children. And here's the reference to Ino, driven mad by the gods when Hera sent her forth to wander in madness from the house. The unhappy woman fell into the sea, impiously murdering her children. Stepping over the sea's edge, she perished with her 2 children. What possible further horror now remains? O womankind in marriage fraught with pain, how many are the troubles you have already wrought for mortal men? What version of Ino is being referenced here? What is between the lines that we don't know? How is this interacting with Medea? She's inflicted by something? What is she inflicted by? She is in this impossible position of loving her children, but having to avenge the wrong that her husband did, almost from a God's eye position. So it's almost as if she herself is reflecting this kind of split personality. Again, reflective of that sense of time itself as being both now and always, that were happening within the ritual moment. And then at the very end, again, implied institution of the cult, Jason asks to bury the children. And again, he's a hero, but he's not. He's also simultaneously just a regular mortal compared to the immortal Medea, like the illusion that's created here. Certainly not. I shall bury them with my own hand, taking them to the sanctuary of Hera Acrea, so that none of my enemies may outrage them by tearing up their graves. And I shall enjoin on this land of Sisyphus a solemn festival and holy rites for all time to come in payment for this unholy murder. As for myself, I shall go to the land of Erechtheus to live with Aegeus. But you, as is fitting, shall die the miserable death of a coward, struck on the head by a piece of the Argo, having seen the bitter result of your marriage to me. And we could certainly see also how this is 2 heroes who have battled each other. That could be read into this. And the hero who has won is Medea. And then finally, at the end, we have Jason's kind of cry. Do you see this, how I'm driven away, and what treatment I endure from this unclean child-murdering monster? But with all the strength I have, I make my lament and endure the gods, calling the heavenly powers to witness that you killed my sons, and now forbid me to touch them or bury their bodies. Oh, that I had never begotten them, never seen them dead at your hands. And then the gods come in and they say, or sorry, not the gods, the chorus comes in and then say, lots of things happen that we can't predict. And that's it, right? That's the end of the tragedy. What men expect is not brought to pass, but a God finds a way to achieve the unexpected. Such is the outcome of this story. So affirmation of the power of the gods. That concludes my portion. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop my share. And again, leaving this open, right? We're just noticing, and then we can see what does Seneca do. And then from there, we can kind of think about all the different elements at play in these 2 very different versions of Medea. So Hillary, if you'd like to take.
Okay, sharing screen. Can everybody see my slides?
Yes.
Great. So, the first thing to note is that the world in which Seneca operates and the sort of plays are very different. So I'm going to just primarily walk you through Roman theatre before we move on to the play. So Lucius Annaeus Seneca was active during Claudius and Nero's time. So we're talking a good wave during the Julio-Claudian era. And he wrote 8 tragedies. 2 are pseudo Seneca, so the Octavia and the and one of the Oedipuses. There's one of his plays that remains unfinished, but other than his tragedies, he wrote philosophical works including De Clementia, letters, and a very interesting satirical work about Claudius's deification, which he satirizes into the pumpkinification of Claudius. Now, Senecan tragedy is quite interesting because it's the only example of Roman tragedy that's fully intact. And it's debatable whether or not his plays were actually performed. So the first quote I have for you here is from Horace's Ars Poeticae, which is from earlier, around the time Augustus was in power, where he says in 185 about what people should see and should not see on stage. Ne pueros coram populo Medea trucidet, which means so that Medea does not butcher her boys before people's eyes. So by this time in Rome, a lot of plays weren't performed per se, but more recited in public spaces where it's not quite public. You're doing it in these symposiums type settings to just your friends. Pliny talks about these sort of gatherings in his letters as well. So the performability is contested, and there are scenes within Seneca that are very difficult to stage. Like in Oedipus, there's a scene where 2 oxes are sacrificed, and there's a very extended scene where they talk about the entrails as they try to read it. Now, Seneca's plays were written probably towards the middle to end of his life. And Fitch splits the tragedies into 3 rough periods. And most likely, Medea was in the second period, where he's a bit more developed in his style. And this is most likely at the end of Claudius or early Neronian period. Seneca's Medea specifically is a very philosophical work. And a lot of it's based on the Stoicism that Seneca is so famous for. In his play, I think that Medea can be seen as a warning to what happens when you're insufficiently stoic. Another theme that turns up quite often is rage. Anger is something that Seneca is very interested in, as he wrote De Ira. And Boyle's commentary mentions this as well. And the definition of anger is the desire to avenge a wrong. Medea is told in several places that she should refrain from anger. And crucially, Jason is the one who tries to curb her urges, but that fails. Seneca's writing is also very, very dense with mythological references. This shows that this was for a very literate audience, and it kind of backs up the idea that this was something that was in recitation. Okay. Plot. So it's structured in 5 acts, and the chorus happens between each act. And it's kind of it kind of leads to a situation where you have the action happening, the chorus saying something totally different, leading to a pseudo dialogue between them. I think that in the context of the play being so philosophical, the sort of dialogue element is very interesting. So Medea invokes the gods at the very beginning, where she calls upon the marriage gods for revenge. And she just expresses her complete rage. The chorus then chimes in to celebrate Jason's marriage and to talk about the benefits of the union. In the second act, Creon tries to exile Medea. She asks for a stay, and she's granted a day to plan. The ode next talks about the disruption to the world caused by the Argonauts, and mentions that the seas are now open and destined to reveal foreign lands. So you very much get a sense of Medea the foreigner and the sort of danger that she is being brought in by the Argonauts. She and Jason then argue, and in this section is when Jason tries to rebuke her for her anger and tells her to find a way to restrain herself. Medea feigns acceptance, but the moment Jason leaves, she goes, "No, I am going to take revenge." The ode then talks about the dangers of a wronged wife, and they pray for Jason's safety. In Act 4, which I find to be one of the most interesting parts, Medea prepares her poison for Creusa, and as she does this, she works herself up into this incredible rage as she's preparing the potion. She talks about reversing the natural way of the world, and this is quite common, where they talk about reversing the tide of the seas to show how far gone she is. We'll look at that passage in a little bit more detail in a moment. So the ode responds to talk about the fear of what Medea might do. The messenger then reports the death of Creusa and Creon. Medea then kills her children on stage. First child is dead at this point. She's on the roof as Jason comes with a mob of people to try and get at Medea. She then takes a second child, kills him, throws the bodies at Jason, and flies away on her chariot. In the meantime, Jason and her have a final argument, and it ends with Jason saying that as she leaves, she's proof that there are no gods in the sky for which she flies. So this is notably different from Euripides because of the violence that you see on stage and Jason's response. Okay. So this translation is my own. I'm going to skip, take you through a few interesting things. One key thing to note is that the meter varies wildly within this section. There are 4 rough sections of meter where it switches between the normal dialogue meter and shorter lines as she's doing her incantation. So here she starts by an invocation to the underworld gods, and she does the regular invocation of the main suspects. We've got Ixen, we get Tantalus, and Sisyphus here, where you can notice that she is mentioning his connection to Jason, to her husband's father-in-law. She then continues to say that she is now creating this sort of magic. She's summoned water from the dry clouds. She has upset the laws of heaven and leading to all kinds of phenomena that wouldn't normally happen. So she continues to do this. She reverses the tides of the river, and the waves have completely crashed by the command of her voice. As she does this, she then brings up potions, ingredients for her potion. She produces all of this, including the venom of Hercules, the Ottoman pyre. And you can just see how she gets more and more worked up with time. So you'll notice how the meter, the lines get shorter and shorter as this happens. And she sees the swift chariot of Hecate as the god emerges from her prayer. And she ends this by giving a liquid sacrifice by learning how to draw deer blood, which is obviously relevant as she kills her children. And she strikes her own blood from her arm. She ends this by saying that the reason she does this is always Jason. So her rage is absolutely clear in this passage, and the way she invokes all kinds of characters from mythology shows you how dense this is, because all of these references are very tightly packed, and to show you the extent to which she is involved within the mythological landscape. Her magical powers also are reminiscent of the trope in Roman poetry by this point of women being a bit mad, and this takes after the idea of furor and madness as part of love. So with that in mind, what were Seneca's influences for his Medea? Now, a lot of Roman plays are no longer extant, but some other Roman playwrights, including Ennius, Pacuvius, and Accius, also did their own Medeas. Ennius's version was also known to Cicero, and that was called Medea Exul, which focuses on her role as an exile. So you can tell that the foreigner theme is already quite important by this point. Seneca especially draws upon Ovid, who handles her story in Heroides, the Metamorphosis, and his own Medea, which did not survive. In the Loeb introduction, there's a suggestion that he did not adapt his own Medea out of Euripides, who humanizes her more, but this is most likely a collection of stories from other Roman sources. What are the main takeaways? Violence is hugely important in Roman theater. This is a part of the spectacle culture where we've got gladiators who could be dressed up within mythology. So in Martial, there's a story of someone who was executed while being staged as Orpheus, with the bears and everything set up to mimic that myth. So this is very different to the Greek aversion to bloodshed on stage. Seneca's plays are very full of violent imagery and violence happening on stage. His plays are also very psychological. Like Euripides, he operates within a time of deep instability under both Claudius and Nero. While it's true that this happens in the early part of Nero's era, with the 5 good years with him, Burrus, and Agrippina in charge, it's still quite a difficult period, and he is trying to contain Nero's excesses as his tutor and advisor. The interplay of the chorus and Medea is interesting because they really respond to each other in a way that I mentioned earlier, being rather dialogue-like. And finally, the stoicism is evident throughout this play. Seneca's main message is be stoic. If you're not stoic, badness takes over, and this is what could happen. Jason tries to reason with Medea and tries to control her angry heart by telling her to control her era, which, as we know, was a very important concept to Seneca. So for sources, Boyle's commentary on the Medea is very interesting and worth reading. The Arison Phillips text from Liverpool Classical Press is also very interesting. And the translation that I wrote is available in the University of Chicago's undergraduate journal. This is a very good translation to read if you're interested. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Hilary. Very interesting, the attention to Stoicism. And that feels very much like a parallel to the concern with myth and the relationship to the gods, and how ritual is trying to create a sense of harmony among the unity of, to create unity of time. I'm going to stop the recording now so that we can have a discussion. So let me do that.